and welcome to the latest episode of If Data Could Talk. As always, we're here with the best stories you need to better understand data in whatever walk of life you are using data. Our goal is to find those stories and help find the great takeaways that you can apply to your everyday. So coming up this week, we have a look at a pandemic game, not Pandemic the board game. Amanda and I could talk about that for a long time, but that's a different show on a different topic, I think, Amanda. It's a simulation of what could happen based on your behavior in a pandemic. And then we have an interview with our special guest, Larry Samuelson. So I'm your host, Andy Cockgreve, evangelist at Tableau, and I'm joined again by Amanda. Say hello, Amanda. Tell us your job.
Hi there. I'm Amanda McCulloch. I am the data visualization lead at Excella. I'm also the operations director at the Data Visualization Society. Nice to be back, Andy.
Great to have you with us. And we've got a special guest as well, Larry Samuelson from Yale. Larry, tell us what you do at Yale.
Hi, I'm Larry Samuelson. I'm a professor of economics at Yale University. My work is primarily theoretical, so not often directly involved in data. My specialty is game theory, though it deals with theoretical techniques. The ultimate goal is to say something about the world around us and to use the data in that world to inform our models. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, delighted to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining today. So, first thing we wanted to talk about was Shirley Wu's pandemic game. Take a look at this on screen. This is a simulation by Shirley Wu and a big team of collaborators, and it shows how an infectious disease might spread over 8 weeks in your community using real demographic data. You type in your zip code, US only, unfortunately, and then you make decisions about how many times you're going to go out in the next 8 weeks. If you stay at home too much, you're going to run out of food. But if you go out too often, the disease is going to spread in the exponential way we've seen in the models over the last several weeks. So that's kind of what we already know about COVID-19 behavior. But here's the rub. The summary at the end drives home how your decisions that might have seemed trivial, should I go out once or twice this week or 3 times? Actually, as a collective set of decisions among your entire community, the sum is much greater than the parts. The simulation is putting you in control of how small decisions can make a big impact. I think it's really powerful, Amanda. So Amanda shared this with me. I enjoyed playing the game a couple of times, first as a responsible citizen and then as a reckless citizen. And the different outcomes are really well spaced. And we're going to be talking to Larry in a few minutes. I don't know much about game theory, but my layman's understanding is that this kind of is game theory, right? It's how a bunch of agents' decisions collect together to make different outcomes which influence the individuals or the collective. And at that point, that's where this layperson probably needs to stop talking before I say something dangerously wrong. So, Amanda, what do you want to add about the pandemic game, which everybody should go check out?
So I think from a public health perspective, it's really interesting because it puts, like you said, Andy, people in control of making individual choices. I think in public health, we think a lot about kind of individual decision making and how collective individual decisions all come together to influence broader public health outcomes. So as a public health professional, I think it's fascinating. And things that kind of gamify this data are really interesting to me in terms of providing a different, more experiential way for someone to interact with the kind of data we're realistically seeing all over the news right now. I also think it's interesting that Shirley and her collaborators chose to very explicitly say, this is not us modeling out COVID-19 in our simulation. Instead, they say this is an illustrative disease or virus that can spread exponentially similar to COVID-19, and they provide really detailed notes and methodologies around their sourcing and all of the other information that went into the game, because there is a lot of real demographic data about your zip code, about the kind of place you live in, those kind of things. I mean, mine in DC told me which hospital was filling up as the hospital beds got occupied, and it was the hospital down the street from me. And so there's a lot of things that make it feel really real, but at the same time, they're very blunt about the fact that there are so many unknowns about COVID-19 that this isn't that specific disease, which I appreciate as someone looking at the public health data.
Yeah, it's interesting. The methodology, the sources, and the details, that's something that guys, it's obviously been so important in this crisis to not take any chart or visualization just on its first appearance. To really understand it, you've got to dig down into the data. And I think that's really got to be true of any visualization you consume wherever you're doing it. You've got to be a critical audience member and say, okay, the chart is going up or the chart is going down. I wonder what is being hidden by this representation of the information. So yeah, their methodology is incredible, or incredibly detailed, and very good too. Larry, I did want to ask you, I've made a claim that this to me is what game theory is about. Am I way off the mark? What was your take on this the pandemic game?
You were on the mark. Game theory is the study of decision making in circumstances where people are affected by their own decisions and the decisions of others. Game theory then is a tool to examine behavior, either descriptively or prescriptively, anytime people's behavior is interlinked. I didn't know the people in the pandemic game until preparing for this. I not only enjoyed it immensely, but I would recommend that everyone play this game. It's one thing to get a call from your local elected official or to see in a newscast or read it in a paper that you should stay home, that you should socially distance, that you should avoid large gatherings. Very hard in the abstract to know why, what that means, what the impact is. The game illustrated that very nicely. I think we would all have a better idea how we should behave if we played the game.
Yeah, I agree. There was another great visualization in the New York Times last week about how short or long can you make it till we get a vaccination for COVID-19, and it puts you in control of the numbers, which go forward to whether or not we'll have a vaccine in 18 months or many years. And that experience of being in control of the data really brings home things that might have been abstract otherwise. Brilliant. So those watching, have you played with the pandemic game or seen other simulations like this? Let us know what you've been looking at in the comments. And what other in control simulations have you seen, like the New York Times, that maybe bring that concept about COVID-19 or something else to life? So thanks, Larry. Thanks, Amanda, for that. And next up, we have our interview with Larry Samuelson.
So I'm really excited to launch into this interview and this topic today because it's connecting two things that we've all seen in the news a lot around economics and public health. And so, Larry, it's great to connect with you on the talk today. I think we want to kick off and think about what metrics or charts are economists looking at to understand the impact of COVID-19.
Thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here. Each morning, I look at a series of charts for countries or for states or regions of countries, if they're large enough, that report the time series for the total number of COVID cases, the number of new cases per day, the number of deaths per day. These three together give a lot of information pertinent to how we might think about reopening our economies. One model, for example, which I think of as the New Zealand model, is that you keep the economy locked down until you've essentially eliminated the COVID virus from your population. Here you see the total number of cases not only flattens, a word we've heard so much of lately, but actually becomes flat and the new cases disappear. Another model exemplified by, say, South Korea is that you open earlier than that, but after you have enough technology in place to keep track of all the cases and to address the cases. Here, the total number of cases, again, flattens, but doesn't become completely horizontal, continues to grow. You still see some new cases each day, but you see very few deaths. Yet another model, Sweden is perhaps the best example, pretty much doesn't shut the economy at all. You attempt to shelter your most vulnerable residents so that you have very few deaths, but then you let the cases accumulate. Here, the total number of cases perhaps doesn't grow exponentially, but does still grow. The number of new cases, you hope, remains relatively constant. That's already a fair success looking at the data when you see the number of total cases increase, but the number of new cases remain relatively constant. You're spreading at less than would be the case if you took no actions. But there you're going to see some reasonable number of deaths. One hopes not too many, if you are appropriately sheltering your more vulnerable residents, but you're still going to see some. There's perhaps a fourth model of reopening. I saw it in a recent post called the dumb model of reopening. And in practice, every reopening is going to be some mix of one of these three and some amount of dumbness. But these three statistics are a good guide as to which of those various courses might be appropriate for bringing the economy on track and which of those we might begin at which time. So I think they contain together, no single one of them, a great deal of information that's relevant to these decisions.
Well, it's interesting because you point to a lot of the public health measures and public health data that we're looking at, not looking at bringing in a lot of additional economic data, which I think is a big conversation folks have started focusing on is what data do we look at as we make these choices? So if we look at more of a broad level and at a policy level, how should policymakers and also organizational leaders weigh these considerations about public health and the economy, especially when many of the metrics that you've named have a lot of uncertainty related to them in terms of the quality of that data and how we use it for decision making?
Let me take those two in reverse order. The first one you mentioned was the uncertainty about the data. Each morning, the Washington Post, I don't necessarily want to pick on them, but I happen to look at this, have a chart giving a time series of deaths per day. And this chart basically looks like the back of a stegosaurus. Maybe it's an abstract stegosaurus, but nonetheless like a stegosaurus. The tremendous variation there is going to reflect some variation in deaths per day, but a lot of variation in the quality of the data. And that makes it all the harder to know where we are and what might be a reasonable policy response. We see similar variation across space as well as across time. Germany has a relatively low death rate. Belgium has a relatively high death rate. Partly this reflects differences in their policies. It also reflects a great deal of difference in their data procedures. Belgium is very inclusive in characterizing something as a COVID death. Germany, much less so. All of this makes it very hard to look at the data and have any good understanding of what the appropriate policy response is. We see these guidelines such as 2 weeks of declining cases. And those are very nice guidelines to state, very much harder to know when we are really in such a situation. So data uncertainty, that's going to be a plague for those of us trying to deal with this plague. Now, the first part of your question, how should policymakers balance public health and economic considerations? This is often described as a conflict, that on the one hand, we have public health motivation for keeping the economy relatively closed. On the other hand, we have economic pressures asking us to open this economy. I see much less conflict there. The economy runs to a great extent on confidence. We could announce today that every bit of the economy was open again. But if people don't have confidence, it's not going to make any difference. If people aren't comfortable going to restaurants, going to stores, going to concerts, going to sporting events, traveling on airplanes, announcing that the economy's open is not going to bring its activity back to life. A necessary condition for getting the economy going is to have people confident of the public health situation. And so I don't see much conflict here. We cannot keep the economy locked down until we have a vaccine. That's going to be the ultimate public health solution. We're going to have to reopen to some extent. But we're going to have to manage that at a pace that matches the confidence that people have in the public health situation. And so whatever that involves, social distancing, wearing masks, testing, we're going to have to manage that to restore the trust people have in their ordinary activities to get the economy going together. So that has to be our first priority.
So I know at the top of the segment, we talked a bit about game theory and what it is, and focusing on this question about individual decision making that have kind of collective impacts. And I know right now there's a lot of data swirling around in terms of all the charts and the graphs and all the information that we're talking about here that is not just informing policy level decision making, but also individual decisions. And so do you have a sense from all of your study about what that point is where we become so saturated with information that we can't make good use of it, or it stops informing our decisions?
I think we are very often so saturated with information that it's difficult to make good decisions. And the difficulty is extracting the useful information from the background noise. In this case, there are some things that we really know very little about, despite all the data we have, that it would be very helpful to know a great deal more about. On the public health side, a number that gets a lot of attention is the number R naught. This is a measure of the propensity of the virus to spread. Roughly speaking, R naught is the expected number of additional people that each newly infected person infects. The magic R naught for pandemics is 1. If you're less than 1, you're in good shape. You can expect this disease to disappear on its own accord. If it's more than 1, you're in much less good shape. Estimates of R naught for the Spanish flu that about a century ago wreaked such havoc are between 1 and 2, often close to 2. Estimates of R naught for the coronavirus are much higher than that. But what we don't understand is where the high R naught is coming from. How much can our behavior affect this R naught? The point of the lockdown, the point of the social distancing, the point of the stay at home, of the wearing a mask is to bring R naught down. One possibility is that the high value of R naught is driven to a great extent by what I refer to as super spreaders, events that bring many people together in close proximity. If that's the bulk of the force behind this high value of R naught, then we could open many ordinary parts of our economy and still stay away from mass sporting events, parades, concerts, and have a reasonable handle on this. If instead the R naught is driven by ordinary interactions between people, then we have to approach this quite differently. So it'd be really helpful, instead of to have just the estimates we have of this value of R naught, to know quite a bit more about the mechanism behind it, about the distribution of spreading. Are we seeing a distribution with heavy tails of small incidents doing an extraordinary amount of spreading, or are we seeing something more evenly distributed?
It's interesting to me, this kind of hearing just so many nods to all these public health concepts and the ways public health data really kind of informs a lot of these decisions. I know, Andy, you've been looking at a lot of these same data in the media and other spaces. Do you have thoughts or follow-ups about this question about how that data influences our choices and behaviors?
Yeah, I just think, generalizing this out, it's, I think if I was a decision maker, I would fear I would just be paralyzed when trying to make a decision. In the you talked about uncertainty, Larry, and in our day-to-day lives, when I'm trying to analyze my own part of the work I do, my data's uncertain, but so I operate on hunches and have a conversation with my manager and my leaders, and we make decisions, and that's fine. All I'm doing is making content and writing books, right? But then when you've got this uncertainty at this high level with this high pressure, coping with that uncertainty and then making the decisions just seems so difficult. And but it does bring it back to how we use data in our work lives as well, to me, because they are the challenging decisions we make. A lot of people make a lot of a big noise about data driving all your decisions. It's like, well, as we see now, you cannot drive decisions about ending the lockdown by data alone. At least at some point, you have to weigh up the pros and cons. I would find that very, very difficult.
Let me say something about the economic side of this. There, a great deal of the attention is devoted to the unemployment rate, the number of unemployed, the number of jobs lost, some aggregate measure of people being separated from employment. What it would be very helpful there to know is how connected these people still are to their firms or their employers. We see here a difference between Europe and the US. The primary form of relief in much of Europe is not to pay individuals, but to pay firms, to pay people not to work. And so that the employees are sent home, the firms continue to pay them, the government subsidizes those payments. That has the advantage that the people remain connected to their employment. And so when the economy reopens, it should be relatively straightforward to bring them back. The productive capacity is still intact. It's as if we've just pushed a pause button. In other countries, the US is one, much more of the emphasis has gone to aid to individuals, and as a result, individuals have a tendency to become separated from their firms. They're laid off, they've lost their jobs. To the extent possible, they will look for others, they will seek other opportunities, they will rearrange their lives. When we do decide to reopen, we will have lost many of the connections between the workers and the firms, and it will take some time to get that sorting, that matching back into place. It's important to know how many people are out of work. It's also important to know about the circumstances in which they're out of work. Do they view themselves, do their employers view them as still having a job that's just been paused? Are they completely separated?
That's a big question in terms of nuance in those numbers. And we've seen those numbers on like the chart that went through the masthead on the New York Times or on the Wall Street Journal. And those big numbers get pulled around a lot. But I think those nuances sound like a really important piece to dig into. Well, let's wrap up on a kind of maybe more positive note. So, Larry, what data or stories have you seen that are giving you hope in this challenging time right now?
I think one of the most interesting tidbits that is emerging is that the number of asymptomatic cases looks higher than we thought, looks perhaps a lot higher than we thought. This is good news and bad news. The good news is this means the mortality rate is smaller than we thought. The bad news means there are a lot more potentially infectious people in the population than we thought. If our model is to eliminate the virus, it looks like it's going to be more difficult than we had planned. If our model is to control the virus without too many deaths, without too much damage, that might be a little bit more hopeful than planned. Again, the difficulty is we have no real idea what the extent of this is. Our testing has been focused on symptomatic people, and so we have some fair picture of the population that has shown symptoms of the virus. We have very much fuzzier a picture of the total extent of the virus in our population. And that's cause for hope. That's cause for concern.
It feels like that kind of classic, every time we talk about data visualization, it comes down to what should you do? Well, it depends. There's different sides to every story and every kind of slice of data. With that, I think it's been great to talk to you, Larry, and to hear your insights on looking at this overall situation from an economic lens and also digging in to some of the ways you're using and looking at the public health data. Andy, why don't I hand it back over to you to wrap us up today?
All right. Thank you, Amanda. Thanks so much, Larry. That was fascinating. That concludes our time today. If you want to find links to the things we've talked about, there is a blog post on Tableau's corporate blog. That's tableau.com/blog. We've got a link to Shirley's pandemic gain and some other simulations we found across the media where you are in control of the outcomes. So take a look at those, let us know what you think, and share any other ones you find with us. And with that, wherever you are, I hope you've had a great time. Please subscribe, and we will see you next time on If Data Could Talk. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Andy.
Bye-bye.